Hello, I'm Sami Zaidan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your look at the world of business and economics. This week, billionaires in space. We go beyond tourism to see how the world's richest men are making a grab to control the space industry. Are cows the new coal? Agriculture accounts for a third of all global greenhouse gases, but where are the targets to cut emissions? And a small Iraqi town blames oil production pollution for killing its people. Now, for decades, space was the preserve of governments and accessible only by taxpayer-funded rockets. Its exploration was politicized by Cold War rivalries. There was the odd tourist who occasionally, though, hitched a ride to help out a cash-strapped nation. But in the last month, privateers have wrestled attention away from the government-sponsored launches. Now, billionaires are accelerating our passion for the heavens. First, 70-year-old serial entrepreneur Richard Branson ended his 17-year quest to travel into space on board his reusable plane. It's not known how much has been spent to reach this stage, but the recently New York-listed company burnt through $250 million in 2020. However, it doesn't have debt. Then there's the question as to whether Branson actually crossed the threshold for space, the Kármán line. Rival billionaire Jeff Bezos succeeded in doing that. The world's richest man initially invested $500 million of his own money in 2014. As of 2016, he's been cashing in his ever-increasing Amazon stock to spend $1 billion a year on Blue Origin. And of course, there's Elon Musk's SpaceX. It's already won contracts and has flown astronauts to the International Space Station. His company is estimated to be worth $46 billion. Bezos and Musk deploy reusable rockets, the stuff of science fiction dreams, to cut down on the cost of getting men into space. Now, whatever your feelings about these endeavors, you could argue a lot of money is being wasted by billionaires for other billionaires to enjoy a few minutes of weightlessness. And what of the carbon footprint of sending the wealthy into space? There's also much more to space. According to Morgan Stanley, the global space industry could generate revenue of more than $1 trillion in 2040. That's up from the $350 billion currently. Yet it might not be space tourism that's the cash cow, but rather satellite internet service. It may not surprise you that Elon Musk is already deploying 1,500 satellites to blanket the Earth and provide internet access. That could cost up to $10 billion to get it operational, but it could bring in revenue of $30 billion a year. It's already in testing, costing $99 a month, with the subsidized antenna to receive a signal costing $499. What's the purpose of that? Well, our insatiable appetite for internet-linked services. And there's more demand coming as autonomous vehicles are rolled out. But he also faces competition from the British government's rival OneWeb, which was rescued from bankruptcy. And unsurprisingly, Virgin Galactic is one company that will be using its booster technology to put satellites into space from a spaceport near you. And one of those sites could be Spaceport Cornwall. I'm delighted to say the head of the venture, Melissa Thorpe, joins us via Skype from Truro in the UK. Good to have you with us. So, Melissa, Spaceport Cornwall will be a horizontal launch site, right, where modified planes will be launching satellites into orbit. Why a horizontal launch, though?
Hi, yes. So horizontal launch is kind of what we feel is the way forward for satellite launch, because you can use existing airports and existing runways anywhere in the world that has a long enough runway. And here at Cornwall Airport, Newquay, we have a long runway that goes direct over the sea with low residential build-up around it. So it means that the systems like Virgin Orbit, who we're working with, can take off at the end of the runway, go out over the sea and deploy the rocket midair. So it's a different way of doing it, but it's using an existing asset, an existing airport, rather than a launch pad, somewhere really remote.
All right, well, tell us more about the first launch that's planned in the spring of 2022 with Virgin Orbit, right?
Yeah, so that's the plan. About this time next year, actually, we're hoping to have our first launch with Virgin Orbit. That'll be the first launch from UK soil ever. So it's obviously very exciting for us here in the UK. And that will be a 3-day event. It's going to be a really big festival and celebration of the space industry in the UK, and to get those satellites up to space for the first time here, because we've never been able to launch from the UK. And we build a huge majority of the world's small satellites here, but we can't launch them at the moment. So it is a big opportunity for the UK.
You've also recently signed a deal with Sierra Space, haven't you? How soon will that translate into a launch?
Sierra Space is a very different system for us, so it will take off vertically somewhere else in the world, but it needs a horizontal spaceport to land at, so a runway to return from space. So that will be their return location, where they'll be bringing amazing R&D and research back from microgravity that we can process here in the UK. And we're looking at doing that in the next 5 or so years. They're due to have their first launch out in Colorado in 2023. So it's a few years away still, but it's something that we're working on the concept of operations for at the moment. We've signed the MOU with them. So the relationship will develop over the next few years, and we hope to be able to have them landing in the near future.
Now, we've talked a little bit about satellites. What about space tourism? Could we see that from spaceports?
At the moment, we're just focused on satellite launch. That's hard enough, I would say, to get up and running for the first time. So we'll be really focusing on that over the next few years. But human spaceflight and space tourism being part of that is obviously really exciting and gets all the headlines. For us, I think the future will be in that human spaceflight element. So looking at that microgravity research, putting more humans and researchers into space to test different healthcare solutions up in low Earth orbit, I think is a really exciting opportunity. And space tourism, who knows, as the market develops and as more launches happen over in the US, maybe that's something that the UK might look to do in the future. But, you know, hats off to the companies doing it, because we know how difficult it is. And congratulations, obviously, to Blue Origin and to Virgin Galactic, who did recently.
We've seen a lot of billionaires in the headlines recently. You're right about that. Would the commercialization of space, the progress that's taking place, would any of that be possible without billionaires like Branson, Musk and Bezos?
You know, I think it's actually taken place of what governments used to do in the space industry. Governments and state-led enterprises used to put most of the funding into space. And now what you're seeing in the new space industry today is entrepreneurs, billionaires, and private companies actually doing a lot of the pioneering activity. And I think that's really interesting for the industry, because what you're seeing is new entrants into the market with obviously different ideas from different backgrounds, different industries. Making the most of space to help benefit life here on Earth. So I think they are pioneering, and they're opening up space and access to space for more businesses and more people. So I think it is a good thing.
Is it worth it? Is the carbon footprint, though, worth it for what? For at least some of it, when we talk about space tourism, is going to be ultimately, some might say, about putting billionaires in space to have a little bit of fun.
I think there's two sides to that story. I think the impact of launches has been something that's been quite secretive over the years, and that's something that we're trying to change here at Spaceport Cornwall. So responsible launching these technologies to space cleaner and greener, I think, is something that spaceports around the world need to be challenged on, and that's something that we want to be doing here. But also, I think you put some of the most influential people into space, and that overview effect, they call it, for them to see the curvature of the Earth and maybe challenge and change their perceptions about their activities on Earth, I think could be actually really powerful. So I think there's two sides to it. I think if we decrease the impact of that launch and work together on that, but also, you know, trying to have a reason for these people going to space, and that they'll come back to Earth and maybe make some change and action to climate change.
Let's hope so. It's always good to be optimistic. Space tourism has grabbed a lot of the headlines recently, but it's only expected to be an $8 billion industry, right? When you look at the total value of the space industry right now, $350 billion. That's obviously just a drop in the bucket. What is the rest of the bucket made up of? What are the biggest markets there for space?
It's pretty much everything we do in daily life, modern life now here. It's from going and getting money out of an ATM to ordering prescriptions online to healthcare to agriculture and driverless tractors and making other industries more efficient from space technologies. That's where the value of space really is. So going and getting better access to space for satellites, for space technology is huge, because we can get some of these amazing, innovative technologies to where they need to be. And to make our lives on Earth more efficient, and also to provide the imagery and unbiased information from space about Earth down to change policy and to influence policy to start to tackle some of the biggest global challenges that we have. So I think the real value of space, as exciting as the tourism side is, the real value is benefiting life on Earth with making our lives more efficient and more environmentally friendly from these technologies.
Is space safe, though, in the hands of billionaires making a grab for what is ultimately a $1 trillion market? I mean, they may be the richest people on Earth, but they don't always have the best track records in people or business management.
I think from opening up space commercially, and I think with all these new entrants, whether it's billionaires or businesses, but you can't forget that it's still a domain of governments. And I think the United Nations, for instance, is working incredibly hard on getting some fundamental policies to go into space, that we protect democracy in space, that we protect peace in space. And that's something that I think the industry is actually collectively working on together. And from what I've seen, it is moving in a positive direction, but there still is a lot of work to be done on how space will be used and who, fundamentally is responsible for their practices in space. And we see that with space debris, for instance, and that is something that is starting to change in a positive way. So I think it is up to us as spaceports to maybe be as a gateway to space of what we are putting into space. And have a responsibility there as well. So I think the ethics of space is something that is growing and moving in the right direction. But like I said, there's still a lot of work to be done.
All right. Thanks so much for talking to us, Melissa.
Oh, thank you.
People in a small town in southern Iraq say pollution from oil production is killing them. They're blaming the process of gas flaring. That's when oil is extracted and excess natural gas is burned off, releasing CO2 and methane. The Iraqi government is investing billions in an attempt to use the gas for electricity. But as Natasha Ghunaim reports from Bahla village in Basra, many say it's already too late.
People living in the village of Bahla take visitors here. They say gas flaring from oil production decimated their generations-old palm trees, leaving behind nothing but trunks. When we met the village elders, they said everyone knows someone who is diagnosed with or who has died from cancer.
I already have cancer and only God helps me. We continue to be worried about our families and loved ones.
The Basra Health Department in southern Iraq says the pollution from oil production is making people and animals in the area sick. The Iraqi High Commission for Human Rights says due to the high rate of cancer in Basra, it's demanding the government work with oil companies to combat pollution.
There is no stability for 6 or 7 years. Every 2 years there is some challenge, political challenge, security challenge. Gas is long-term investment. It needs some stability. And it needs some cash and commitment.
The World Bank ranks Iraq number 2 behind Russia when it comes to gas flaring. Instead of polluting the air, the gas could be recovered and sold or used to generate electricity for millions of people. The Basra Gas Company is investing $3 billion to do just that at the Rumaila oil field, Iraq's largest.
Anything that the Iraqi government can do or its neighbours can do to create a stable environment is good for capturing more gas and for creating a better environment for the Iraqi people.
The people of Bahla say the land their families have been tied to for 200 years is toxic, and they wonder how many more of them will get sick before the government can help them. Natasha Ghunaim, Al Jazeera, Basra, Iraq.
Are cows the new coal? That's the question a $40 trillion investor network is asking. Why? Because farming represents 1/3 of all harmful greenhouse emissions, yet no G20 country has a plan to cut them. Balancing jobs and livelihoods is proving a tough sell for governments. Thousands of farmers recently protested in the Netherlands against the government effort to cut nitrogen emissions. Intensive agriculture and fertilizer use have made the Netherlands one of Europe's largest emitters. Step Vassen reports from The Hague.
Not an unusual sight in the Netherlands these days. Tractors on the streets of The Hague joining a protest. As the police try to block them, it becomes clear that stopping a tractor isn't easy.
We hope that the government will understand that the Netherlands can't exist without farmers. The Netherlands needs farmers. We are producing the most sustainable food worldwide. So without us, I don't know who will feed all these people.
After milking his cows, dairy farmer Jan van der Wind left his farm to get some answers from the government. For generations, his family has farmed in an area where experts now say there's no future for large farms. It's just not sustainable if a government target of nitrogen emission reduction is to be met.
We also don't want the environment to be polluted. There is no debate about that. But now the Netherlands wants to take drastic steps, and farmers are the first to be targeted, and I am concerned that in 10 years, when farms are gone, we will regret this.
Like more than 50,000 Dutch farmers, his 17-year-old son Tom, who is keen to continue the farm, has no idea what lies ahead.
Young farmers driving for hours on their tractors to demand certainty about their future. If ecologists, environmental groups and increasingly politicians have their way, farming as we know it in the Netherlands can't exist any longer. A message many here are not ready to hear.
And here you see a lot of dead trees and dying trees with very low vitality, with very low leaves.
An expert on the effects of nitrogen emissions, researcher Roland Bobbing wrote an alarming report for Greenpeace. His conclusion: large parts of the Dutch ecosystem have been so badly affected that they will be lost if the government does not act now.
I think it is very urgent, and I mean you cannot do it in 1 or 2 years. You need maybe 5 to 10 years, a really high reduction of the nitrogen deposition, maybe 50 to 70%. And therefore you need a different agricultural system in the Netherlands.
Greenpeace has threatened to take the Dutch state to court for violating European regulations if the government does not reduce nitrogen emissions much further. Amidst all the pressure, some farmers are starting to realize that business as usual won't be an option for much longer. But farmers' organizations say billions of euros are needed to save Dutch farms and make them environmental friendly. Step Vassen, Al Jazeera, The Hague.
Reaching net zero emissions will be impossible without a radical overhaul of the agricultural sector, says my next guest. Teni Ekundare is the head of investor outreach at the FAIRR initiative, which represents investors with $40 trillion under management. Good to have you with us, Teni. So why have G20 nations left out any plans for a cut of emissions from farming?
Yes, great to be here. Thanks for having me, Sammy. Well, first of all, just wanting to mention that climate obviously is a huge issue that we're all facing globally. And since inception of FAIRR, we have been looking at climate risk. There's been a real focus on that. And we've been seeing that companies are doing more about trying to engage on this topic, and investors as well. And we just need regulators to step forward and do a little bit more here as well. Now, in terms of why the G20 nations have left this out, I think it's more that historically it has been a really difficult sector when it comes to decarbonizing. Obviously, it has very close links with livelihoods and income for a vast majority of people. And also there is still a lack of disclosure, and it's been difficult in terms of actually trying to measure climate impacts and measure emissions and try to understand who is responsible for specifically what kinds of emissions. And so what we're saying is that there needs to be significant reductions, and these significant reductions are in fact possible, but we just need it to be that governments and policymakers and regulators are really starting to put their eyes on this and address this fully. So we are hoping that... Let me jump in there
and say, when you say there needs to be reductions, what are we talking about? What do they need to do? What do they need to cut?
Yes, well, there's so much that there's so many different areas within agriculture that can be reduced, where emissions can be reduced. So if you think about the feed that they give the animals, for example, trying to reduce the emissions that are actually generated within the animal. When you think about the volume of animal that's being produced, we have found that over the last year, there was actually been an increase in emissions from animal agriculture, and really that is logic as partly as a result of the fact that more animals are being produced and so emitting that way. There needs to be an adoption of electric vehicles, for example, and really trying to stop the emissions that happen. So there are lots of areas in the production of the animal animal protein that we could start to see reductions happen. We just need to see that there's more regulations and more incentivization of farmers to actually do things like this.
Is there a happy balance between livelihoods and farming emissions?
Absolutely, I believe that there is. It's not that we are saying
what does
that
it
there
look
needs
like
to be
then? Because I mean, so much agriculture is a big money generator, isn't it?
Exactly, it is. And so that's why I think, as going back to in terms of the emissions coming from the sector, that's why so much needs to be done in terms of if we're going to meet the Paris Agreement, let's make sure agriculture is part of that solution as well. Because it is a huge money generator, but it is also hugely highly emitting as well. So it needs to be that balance between livelihoods and emissions that not all animal farming needs to end. It needs to be that we are empowering farmers to be part of building a more robust and sustainable solution. So where we've seen Biden, for example, the Biden administration announcing $30 billion of incentives to farmers when it comes to carbon capture, or last week we had the UK's National Food Strategy announced, which is, again, incentivizing farmers to actually be part of building the sustainable system. So it's looking at soil improvement, food, flood prevention, carbon sequestration, so that farmers feel that they are part of this solution as well. And on the flip side, we also have to recognize that with the huge emissions that we see, there is that increase in climate risk, which is impacting livelihoods already. So in Texas, you've seen about just under $230 million of losses this year due to the flooding that we've seen. There have been the stress on the animals, and so the heat stress leading to deaths of animals means that this is already costing farmers their livelihood, which is why there needs to be more of a response in terms of trying to address the emissions from this area.
I'm glad you mentioned animals there. If we look at some of the figures on this, Teni, 340 million tons of meat globally produced every year. How do we convince people to change their diets?
I think it's making sure that it's not that people feel that they are being dictated to. I think if there's one thing that has come out globally from the last 18 months is that people do not want to feel as if choices are being actively taken away from them and that they're being restricted more and more. So we need to make sure that people are more informed and that they're given choices, but it has to be that they're able to make an informed decision on what it is that they are consuming, whether in this case looking at food or anything else really when it comes to the goods and services that we need to survive and thrive. So I think that it's helping to ensure that supermarkets as well as regulators are playing their part in giving consumers the information they need. So are we actually aware of the reductions, the health benefits, for example, that it has when you reduce your meat consumption, as well as the environmental benefits that comes with that as well. So there needs to be this shift away from dictating and saying consumers must do this or must not do that, but helping them to see, well, what are the alternatives? How can we move towards a more plant-based diet? And what benefits does that have for people, for planets, and for the animals as well?
The more successful, though, that sort of message is, Teni, the less income revenue there will be for big beef suppliers of the world, like Argentina and Brazil. What kind of proposal do you have for them?
Well, we are seeing already that they are starting to understand that this shift is happening. And so it's almost a case of, well, get on board with this shift or get left behind. You are seeing more of the plant-based alternatives start to really move up the agenda when it comes to consumers' purchasing power. And you're seeing, for example, in the US over last year, I think there was about a 200% increase in plant-based products being bought there. And so you're seeing these big beef players start to move towards satisfying that need as well, so that they're not losing out on the new customer and the potential revenue and profitability there, but they're starting to set up their own plant-based protein products as well and their own plant-based brands as well. And so as we see this start to happen, more of the beef producers will actually start to recognize that this is something that they need to be involved in as well in order to make sure they are part of that, they are strategically moving in the right direction for the future of what consumers are actually picking up and choosing to do with their wallet as well.
All right. It's been lovely talking to you. Thanks so much for coming to the show, Teni.
Yes, it's been great being here. Thank you so much.
And that's our show for this week. There's more for you online, though, at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has entire episodes for you to catch up on. I'm Sami Zaidan from the Counting the Cost team here. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.